Hello to everyone, and welcome back to our study in the book of Job. We are in chapter number 2 today, and hopefully this one will be shorter than 17 minutes, which was our length. That might be a record for our introductory study, so we'll try to keep it down a little bit, keep it under control. If you would like the PDF from today's study, you can download it for free at tobelikechrist.com, and there's a link down in the description. Let's begin by going over our high-level short overview outline of the book of Job. So we are in the first section, which is chapters 1 and 2. Job is persecuted by Satan. Now tomorrow, Lord willing, we're going to get into section number 2, which is the meat, the bulk of the chapter. A lot of poetic language is coming up in these future chapters. And in chapter 3 through 37, Job and his friends discuss the reason that he's experiencing all these persecutions and hardships, some of which we talked about in chapter 1. The third section, Job 38 through 41, God speaks with Job and reveals his greatness to him. And then in the last chapter, God restores Job. Going down to our list of significant figures in this chapter, we have God, of course, the sovereign creator of the universe. We have the sons of God, who we mentioned in the last chapter. These are angelic beings or heavenly beings, spiritual beings. They are not equals with God. They are subject to him. We have Satan, who comes with the sons of God to appear before the Lord. And of course, Satan's great desire is to turn men's hearts away from God. He's trying to do that to Job. Job is our key character here. He is an upright man, a very righteous man who puts his faith in God, and he's being persecuted by Satan, and Satan's trying to destroy his faith, basically. One person who unfortunately is trying to help Satan out with that job in this chapter is Job's wife, who's kind of notorious. We don't know her name, but she actually encouraged Job to abandon his faith and go along with Satan, basically. So in chapter 1, we had an initial meeting between the sons of God, Satan, and God himself. We're going to talk about a second meeting between these same individuals in chapter 2. So our first section in chapter 2, verses 1 through 6, Satan appears before God a second time. So sometime after the initial persecution of Job, where Satan took all of Job's stuff, he took all of his family away from him, and of course we read that he failed to turn Job's heart away from God, even though he took all of those things. So sometime after that, Satan appeared before the Lord again, and God asked him the same question that he asked him initially, quote, "From where have you come?" in verse 2. Satan responded the same way that he did in chapter 1. It says, quote, "From going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it." God reminded Satan that he had failed to succeed in his mission, that Job was still faithful to him. Job's heart still belonged to God, even though he didn't have all the possessions that he had before. And Satan suggested that, the real reason that Job hadn't broken was because he hadn't been allowed to affect Job himself. He told God, if I'm allowed to afflict him with bad health, take away his health, then he will curse you, because a man, he may not care about the external things as much, but his own person, his own body, that's what's going to get him to break. And so once again, God gives Satan permission to test his theory, and Satan departs from the presence of the Lord. This gets us to section number 2, verses 7 through 10. Satan afflicts Job with bad health. So Satan struck Job with an illness that caused sores all over his body, from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. And we're told that Job sat in ashes, which was a sign of mourning during those days. And he used a piece of broken pottery to scratch and to scrape his sores. This really sounds like it was a really miserable scene. And this is where Job's wife comes into the picture, and not for a good reason. She comes along and she asks her husband, why are you still faithful to God? Why do you maintain your integrity? Why do you still have confidence in God, even though he's allowed all of these terrible things to happen to you? She said that it would actually be better if he just cursed God and died. Just get it over with. Just curse God and end it. So not exactly the kind of woman that you want to marry if there's any young men out there looking for wives. This is not marriage material. Job, though, he dismissed the suggestion to his credit. He says to his wife that he had received many good days from the Lord in his lifetime. He wasn't going to curse God just because he was experiencing some hard days now. And we're told in verse 10, the text says this, quote, "In all this, Job did not sin with his lips." So he's living up to that reputation that he had, that as we were introduced to him in the beginning of the book, that he was an upright and a blameless man. And yet again, Satan is thwarted. So he's wrong for a second time. God's champion wins the day. That takes us to section number 3, Job's 3 friends. And we're going to be talking about these guys for several chapters. This is verse 11 through 13. When Job's 3 friends heard about all the calamity that had befallen him, they came and they sat with him to sympathize with him for 7 days. They were trying to comfort him. Their names were Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And the text says that they didn't say anything to Job for the first 7 days because they saw how immense his suffering was. And chapter 3 is going to pick up after those 7 days where the dialogue between them begins to pick up. And that dialogue is what we're going to follow through much of the book of Job. They're going to be discussing why it is that all this suffering has befallen their friend. Talking about the question of suffering, that leads us into our application for today. When you're in a war, if you're a soldier, you expect to take fire from enemy forces, right? You know that there's an enemy on the other side that's actively trying to do you harm. I think sometimes as Christians, though, we forget that we are in a spiritual war. We forget that we have real enemies who are shooting at us with real weapons that can inflict harm. The result, or one possible result of forgetting that we're in a war, is that when we're taking that fire, we may turn on our own general. We may start accusing our own general of firing on us as if he's trying to inflict suffering on us, when in reality it's the enemies across the battle line. Now, this may sound kind of ridiculous, and in normal circumstances, it is ridiculous. It's ridiculous for an army to blame their own general for bullets that are flying at them from across enemy lines. So the question is, why do we do this to God while we are engaged in our own battle? Who often gets the blame when bad things happen? Something bad happens to us and we're like, oh God, why did you allow this to happen? Why did you do this to me? Why did you let me get into this situation? Why did you inflict this disease or this harm or this suffering on me? We often blame God for bad things that happen to us and the suffering that we face, but Job chapter 2 places the blame where it belongs, on the real enemy. The next time something goes wrong in your life, how about you curse Satan instead of cursing God? Job didn't know exactly what was going on here, but he refrained from cursing God, and he was wise in doing that because it wasn't actually God who was doing all of these things to him. It was Satan. One of Satan's greatest tricks is taking shots at us and getting us to blame God for shooting at us. Now, I know there are a lot of good questions about why God permits evil. Why does God permit Satan to exist if he does these things? And I think there are good answers to those questions, more than we can get into in a 5-minute study like this. But I think what Job does teach us is that once all those questions have been answered, there's a place where this blame belongs. And it's not necessarily on God. It's on the enemy of God and our enemy, Satan and his servants. So that's going to do it for our study today. As I mentioned in chapter 3, we're going to get into the dialogue between Job and his friends, and that's going to be a really interesting study in and of itself. But this is the setup, the introduction to Job. It introduces the problem of suffering that needs to be discussed. So Lord willing, I'll see you again tomorrow as we take on chapter 3.